Welcome to the first Butler & Young Building Control podcast. Butler & Young Building Control are the premier building control service provider in the country and are an alternative to using the local authority building control system. We also provide complementary services such as CDMC, Equality Act access audits, fire risk assessments, fire engineering and environmental engineering. If you'd like to find out more about us, visit www.butlerandyoung.co.uk. Butler & Young Building Control have produced a series of podcasts aimed at those seeking knowledge into what the building regulations are, how they are applied, and how best to use them in the design of the built environment. Future podcasts will look at subjects such as fire safety and thermal compliance in more detail. This first podcast in the series will focus upon building regulations basics and will introduce the umbrella legislation, the building regulations themselves, the types of construction work that are exempt or controllable, and the documents that show a path to compliance. So, why do we have building regulations and what is the legislation backing the regulations? The purpose of building regulations is to secure health, safety, welfare, convenience of people in and around buildings, the conservation of fuel and power, the prevention of waste, undue consumption and contamination or misuse of water, furthering the protection or enhancement of the environment, facilitating sustainable development, and furthering the prevention or detection of crime. Although the regulations are administered by approved inspectors such as Butler & Young Building Control and local authorities, any enforcement action is carried out by the relevant local authority under the Building Act 1984, Section 35 and 36. Failure to comply with the regulations is classified as a criminal offence. The primary legislation is the Building Act 1984 and the Sustainable and Secure Buildings Act 2004. These can be viewed with other legislation at www.legislation.gov.uk. The Building Act is the primary legislation that provides the legislative structure for building control in England and Wales. This can be viewed with other legislation at www.legislation.gov.uk. The Act is a consolidation of previous legislation that laid down requirements in relation to health and safety in and about buildings. It consolidates items from as far back as the 1875 Public Health Act, right up to the 1984 Housing and Building Control Act. Other associated legislation are the Town and Country Planning Act, Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, Equality Act, and local acts. Returning to the Building Act, this is split into 5 parts. 1. The building regulations. 2. The supervision of building work by alternatives to the local authorities, such as approved inspectors. 3. Other provisions such as drainage, defective premises, demolitions, and dangerous structures. 4. The general duties of local authorities, including entry to premises and interpretation. 5. Supplementary provisions, such as transition arrangements. The 2 pieces of legislation that set the rules for the administration and application of the building regulations are the Building Regulations 2010 and the Building Regulations Approved Inspector Regulations 2010. So now we know why we have the building regulations and what legislation supports the regulations and the parties involved with their administration. In this, the second part of the podcast, we will explore what type of work is subject to control or is exempt under the regulations, and we will briefly look at the requirements of the regulations themselves. It is difficult to comprehensively list all works subject to building control. A general list that indicates the scope of building control could include building work to building super and substructures, the provision of new buildings, replacement of thermal elements such as glazing, and access to buildings. This list, whilst not exhaustive, gives a feel for the remit of building control. Some types of work are exempt from the regulations, and these are categorised as buildings controlled under other legislation, buildings not frequented by people, greenhouses and agricultural buildings, temporary buildings and ancillary buildings, small detached buildings, and some extensions. Although subject to control, some types of specialist work can be self-certified by the installer. Examples of this are gas, oil and solid fuel appliances, ventilation and air conditioning systems, electrical installations, replacement windows, doors and roof lights, installation of bathroom fittings, hot or cold water systems, microgeneration and renewable energy systems, cavity wall insulation, and finally, the recovering of roofs. Now we have an understanding of the legislative background. What guidance is available to help the designer or constructor of buildings to comply with the building regulations? The guidance is contained in a series of very useful, approved documents. To view and download for free the entire range of approved documents, visit www.planningportal.gov.uk. The guidance in the approved documents is one method of demonstrating compliance. However, it is not the only method. Other guidance documents such as British Standards and CIBSE guides may be used to demonstrate an adequate design to comply with the building regulations. The approved documents are Part A, Structural Stability, Part B, Fire Safety, Part C, Site Preparation and Resistance to Contaminants and Moisture, Part D, Toxic Substances, Part E, Resistance to the Passage of Sound, Part F, Means of Ventilation, Part G, Sanitation, Hot Water Safety and Water Efficiency, Part H, Drainage and Waste Disposal, Part J, Combustion Appliances and Fuel Storage Systems, Part K, Protection from Falling, Collision and Impact, Part L, Conservation of Fuel and Power. Approved documents L1A and L2A refer to work in new buildings, and approved documents L1B and L2B refer to work in existing buildings. Part M, Access to and Use of Buildings. Part N, Glazing, Safety in relation to impact, opening and cleaning. Part P, Electrical Safety. We also have an approved document to support Regulation 7 that tackles materials and workmanship. The private industry has also issued an approved document entitled Basements for Dwellings. This approved document can be found on the Basement Information Centre website at www.basements.org.uk. The Government Department for Communities and Local Government provides the infrastructure to the regulations, and the website www.communities.gov.uk provides valuable information on determinations and appeals, competent person schemes and consultations on future regulations and the future of building control. The building regulations are constantly evolving, and on a 3-year cycle, current approved documents and legislation are reviewed, the industry consulted and revised documents issued. The government, however, makes a great effort to deregulate wherever possible to ease the regulatory burden. In conclusion, the legislation and guidance can be complex, and Butler and Young hope that this podcast has given you a straightforward insight into the legislation and the supporting guidance. Butler and Young Building Control are experts on the subject and are always happy to help, so please give us a call on 0800 652 7172 with your queries. You can also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. In our forthcoming second podcast on building regulations basics, we will compare the two systems of building control and provide 10 tips to help secure building regulations approval. Butler & Young Building Control hope that you have found this podcast to be useful and your feedback is valuable to us. If you have any questions regarding this podcast, or you would like to hear a podcast on a subject that is important to you, please send an email to podcast@butlerandyoung.co.uk.